Welcome back. In this unit, we're going to talk about the relationship between thought and language. And we'll first pay attention to the uh, the framework of knowledge and thinking and where language fits in that. Um, so I hope you like this. Okay. So in this particular unit, these are the topics that we will go over, and here's a quick outline. First, we'll talk about the psycholinguistic, which is the study of how people learn and use language. Then we'll talk about the relationship between language and thought. Then we'll talk about um, how people manipulate using language in a specific way and be aware of that. Then we'll talk about the importance of comprehension. Then we'll end by summarizing everything. So, as we said, psycholinguistics is the study of how we acquire language and how particularly use language. Now, within this context is this idea of um, the utility of language at a very basic level, and how the person who produces language and the other person who consumes language, the relationship between these two. It's important to understand that, to understand how people use language. Because language without uh, some shared communication system or shared understanding of how we communicate doesn't exist. So we need to know the speaker's perspective and the listener's perspective of language. That's where we'll talk about the surface structures and deep structures in a second. We'll understand this better when we put this language construct within the framework of thinking and um, knowledge, which we'll do in the next slide. Okay, so if you remember the thinking and knowledge framework, we said that thinking, if this is you, right? Thinking is a process of making sense of new information by using your existing knowledge, right? In doing so, making sense of this new information will internalize this new information, changing the structure of your knowledge. So this is how dynamic we said that knowledge and thinking are related. And we said within this context, then, there is always some sort of new information that you consume for different purposes, but the basic purpose being to make sense of it, right? Now, what if that information comes from a speaker, right? And so whenever a speaker utters something, that is called a linguistic utterance. Now, with this linguistic utterance, the speaker is trying to convey some meaning or some information that the speaker might have generated based on the thoughts he had produced or based on the knowledge structures he has. So he thought about stuff as a process within the knowledge structure the speaker has and came up with an idea, a meaningful idea. And that meaningful idea is the intended meaning. So the speaker tries to convey something, and the speaker's intention, the intended meaning of what he wants to convey, that is the deeper structure of the information. The intended meaning is a deeper structure. And this deeper structure, which is the intended meaning, can be presented in many multiple ways, right? So same idea can be presented in multiple ways. That's the idea here, right? But the underlying meaning of it is what the original intention of the speaker is, and that is called the deeper structure. That's the deep structure of the information that the speaker is trying to convey. But he may use different linguistic ways of presenting, and that is the linguistic utterance. This is This is the utterance that is imply this particular meaning. Let's take an example. If I want to say that uh, um, I want to convey the idea that I read a book um, called Thought and Knowledge, and it's wonderful. If I want to convey that idea, I can convey that idea in multiple ways, right? But the idea there is basically two ideas that I read a book and it's beautiful. That representation of the meaning at a very basic level is called the intended meaning or the deeper structure. But I can utter this by using a surface level representation, which is the actual thing I say. I can say, "Oh, I read a book and it's beautiful," one way of saying it, or I can say, um, "The book I read the other day is beautiful." Okay, then you can say that I read a book the other day and the book is really beautiful, or book I have read the other day is beautiful. There are multiple ways of presenting this information. Now, this is a very simple example. If you have more complex ideas and the utterances can take multiple ways of presenting. So the intended meaning is the deeper representation, and the way you convey it is a surface representation. Good? Okay. Now, the deeper meaning is related to and closely connected to, in terms of structure, the knowledge of the speaker, and the words he uses to convey it imply the actual language that we use, the words we use, the means of communication. That's one aspect of language. It is a means of communication. Now, that's about the speaker. Now, what about the listener, right? The listener, this linguistic utterance is the new information for the listener. And the new information, the listener will try to make sense of the surface structure, right? And try to understand the intended meaning of the surface structure by using the speaker's own knowledge. You get it? So, so the speaker has to, in order to make sense of what the listener, in order to make sense of what the speaker is saying, had to make an inference, right? An inference that, oh, this utterance means this thing. So the listener can make a right inference or a wrong inference. Does it make sense? So that is the relationship between speaker and listener. While the speakers implies this thing by using the surface structure, the listener uses the surface structure to infer what the speaker might be saying. So there is always this connection, this relationship between what the speaker intends to say and what the listener infers. If these are same, then the communication is good. If this is not same, that's where the issues related to communication come in. And you can see how this relates to the very process of thinking and the very process of using knowledge for different purposes. A speaker, a speaker uses thinking to generate this new information and uses thinking to create a linguistic utterance. The listener uses thinking to make sense of this linguistic utterance based on the background knowledge of the listener and tries to guess what the listener might be, what the speaker might be implying. So one way of thinking about it, again, we talk about this in the upcoming slides, is the idea that a speaker, a speaker implies when he speaks. A listener has to infer what the speaker is implying. In fact, there are terms for this, right? The terms are like authorized inferences and unauthorized inferences. if the inference that the listener makes are the correct inferences that the speaker actually implied, then you call these inferences authorized inferences. These are the inferences that the speaker actually wanted you to make. And that's what he was implying. If you make a wrong inference about what the speaker might be implying, then you're making an unauthorized inference. So a good communication happens when there is a situation where author's implications are accurately inferred by the speaker. And for that, both the speaker and the listener need to follow some rules of communication. And we'll talk about these rules of communication in the upcoming slides. So, as we discussed in the last slide, a speaker makes implications, or he implies or she implies, and the listener has to infer. And the way the speaker implies is by using the surface structure, the actual words used, surface structure, right? And if this surface structure has multiple potential meanings, then the listener has to determine what exactly the speaker was trying to imply. And if that matches, then it's an authorized inference. So it is important on the speaker's part to make sure that the words they use imply one but not multiple things, right? And make sure that there are no possibilities of generating unauthorized inferences that can be done by clarifying clearly as a speaker what you intend to say. And we'll talk about this in the upcoming slides. So ambiguity arises, meaning when the surface structure, the words used have multiple meanings, right? So one example, let's say Matt inherited money. Bertha married Matt. If these are the only two sentences I give you, what kind of inference would you draw? Or do you draw any inference? You may draw the inference that Bertha actually married Matt for money, right? But is that an authorized inference? It may not be an authorized inference. Maybe the speaker is just presenting two different things, but presented in a non-conventional way, which made the listener make an inference. So it is important as a speaker to make sure you're aware of what kind of unauthorized inferences the listener might be making. At the same time, as a listener, you have to be aware of the potential inferences and clarify, make sure you make the right inference. Okay, so one thing I want to add here about the role of language within the context of the thinking and knowledge framework is um that language can be viewed in multiple uh, perspectives. One way of looking at it is the mode of communication. Okay, this mode of communication. So you can define language as a way of communication or a system of communication, um, a system that has the purpose of communication with symbols and rules of combining symbols. Now, it's an important point here about symbols and rules of combining symbols because symbols, the idea of symbols, is an important construct in psychology, especially cognitive psychology. The idea of symbols is that you are everything there is in the external world. You try to either a real concrete thing like pen or uh, an abstract idea, let's say freedom, all these things can be represented in our brain, and that's the basic idea of cognitive psychology, that we represent information in our brains, in our minds. These representations are called symbols. Okay, So if you take a pen, for instance, if this is the pen, this pen is the actual object in the real world, right? And we are representing this in our mind as something. How are we representing it? We're representing as a sound called pen, right? So this sound pen is the representation of the actual object in the real world. Similarly, there could be some abstract ideas, like freedom means something, and that freedom, whatever it means, represents that sound freedom represents whatever you are defining it as. That is represented in your mind as the sound freedom. Again, I'm just taking the auditory here. It applies to any other medium, but this is the usual representation that we think about. Now, um, the idea here is that this way, language is a way of communication, right? Using symbols with rules to combine symbols, right? So, and what makes it symbol is this connection between the object in the real world, pen, and its representation, which is the sound pen, pen, and the actual pen. The relationship is arbitrary. There is no real relationship. It's a very abstract, random relationship. So that's where the shared system comes in. So as long as you and I, meaning that the speaker and the listener, know what the symbol is, we can call a pen a cup and still be okay as long as we both have shared understanding of what these representations or symbols are. Good. And I will actually add a video lecture related to some basics of language, which talks about these things of symbols and rules of combining symbols and what makes language unique to humans and what makes language similar across different languages and how are languages different. So similar and different. Okay, so within that context, then, just to tell you, just to give you a brief idea, that language can be seen as a way of communication, but also can be thought, or thought, okay. Language can also be viewed as a cognitive tool to think. Good. Hold on to that idea. And another way of looking at language is that language is how we think. I'm not saying that we think in one language, which it probably could be correct, but what I'm trying to say is that there is some sort of symbolic manipulation of things when you think, right? So that basic idea that language itself is a process and also a means of thinking and communication is important to keep in mind, right? So in that sense, using language as a tool or a process, then there are different ways of communicating these represented meanings of what you want to convey in your conversations. One way of doing that, which has its own ups and downs, and as a listener and a speaker, you have to be aware of the limitations and the strengths of using such strategies, is the use of analogies. Now, there are different kinds of analogies like metaphors, similes, and things of that sort. I'm going to call all these analogies in general, right? Um, Through analogies like metaphors or similes, what you're trying to do is you're trying to kind of uh, use old concept to understand a new concept. So you're using an old concept to understand the new concept. So remember we talked about how new information is understood within the context of the existing knowledge, correct? That is the idea here, right? But you're doing it by invoking some specific strategies like analogies, right? So For similes, it is like um, X is like Y. Okay. In metaphors, you actually directly um, uh, what do you say? Use like a concrete thing to kind of compare things. Okay. Um, Life is a journey. It's like a metaphor, right? Now, the important thing you need to understand is that the purpose of using analogies, either metaphors or similes, is to kind of elaborate or describe the new information within the context of the existing information. For that to happen, right, you need to know the old information well enough and try to see what are the similarities between the old information and new information and try to describe this new information by using the terms specific to old information. Okay. Now, for that, you need to explicitly make sure that the old and new information are not basically related very superficially. Their relationship would be at the deeper level. Again, you're not conveying or saying that this new information is exactly the old information. What you're saying is the way the concepts in the old information, how they are related, there is such a relationship in the concepts related to the new idea. Okay. So there are good analogies that use two different the new idea and the use analogies that have deeper connections, and bad analogies are those that use comparisons where there are no real underlying comparisons. Okay, let's look at look at one good and one bad um, analogy in the next slide. Okay, so let's look at a good example and a bad example. A good analogy compares two ideas that share underlying meaning, okay, even at the surface level if they differ. Okay, for example, you're saying that life is like a scavenger hunt. Life, scavenger hunt, the two, one has two words, the other one has like one word, and one is in a different context, the other in a different context. Kind of doesn't make sense, right? But if you think about it, this analogy is basically saying that this construct called life and this construct called, this is a new construct, right? And this scavenger hunt is like the old construct, and here you try to find hidden things, right? So you're in the process of finding things that you want to. Now, if you compare it to define it, if you use this analogy to describe life, then what you're saying is that life is finding things in life. In fact, these things could be meaning. So life is a journey of finding meaning. Scavenger hunt is the journey of finding things. So you see that? A good analogy is when the deeper ideas related to one old and new information are direct, even if superficially they look different. That's a good analogy. Let's talk about a bad analogy. A bad analogy is where there is only superficial connection and there is no internal connection, meaning that the way the concepts are organized in one concept and one idea are not related to the other one. For example, um, comparing a boat to a bowling ball, right? Or bowling ball strips. So what is it other than they both starting, they have the same alphabet to start, like B and B. Other than that, it's hard to make connections unless you stretch it too much, and that's where the analogy breaks. So it has to be simple enough and easy for the listener to see the connections, which you could do in the bad good analogy, not in the bad. So another linguistic constructs that you need to be aware of um, when we talk about language, um, and how it is really related to thinking is the categories and labels. Now, just to give you an idea, a category, also called as a concept, right? Okay, a concept is a type of thing, a category of things. Okay, for instance, you say apple, right? When you say apple, you have not just an apple that you experienced this morning, or an apple that you experienced yesterday, or all the apples you experienced in your life, but apple is this generalized knowledge. Remember, we talked about the generalized knowledge about different objects in the real world, different ideas in the real world. So that is a concept. So you have a concept or a category called apple, okay? Which means that it is red, it tastes in a specific way, it is when it is grown and where it is grown, how it is transported, what is the texture, everything you know about apple is stored in this concept in your semantic memory. Remember the conceptual knowledge? That's where it is, right? So why do we have these concepts? Why do we have these semantic memories, semantic knowledge about different concepts or categories? Why do we have that? Well, the reason is that, remember, when within the context of thinking and knowledge, we said that at a very basic level, you're trying to make sense of the new information by using the existing knowledge. This existing knowledge is a network of concepts. So your concept of apple, concept of books, concept of teacher, concept of love, you have all these concepts. The reason we have concepts, or the purpose of it, is that it it enhances our comprehension. In fact, when you look at this new information, you experienced a new apple, let's say. I'm pretty sure you never experienced this apple, right? But when you look at this new information, you're using your knowledge and trying to say, where does this new object fit? Oh, it fits in the category or concept of apples. So what we do is, that's like a basic level of comprehension. It's called perception. You make sense of what it is at a basic level. And we do it on a moment to moment basis. Let's say you're walking, right? You encounter so many things, right? And these things that you encounter need to be quickly identified for you to navigate through the environment, right? So having concepts and using categories and concepts to make sense of things quickly is a natural to us. Okay. So when you look at something, make sense of it, what you're basically doing is you're identifying this new information as belonging to a category of things, a concept. Oh, it's an apple. Oh, this is a book, or this is this. Now, same thing applies to language and the way we use language. So if I give you some information, you're basically using the meaning conveyed with this information to belong to different categories and try to make sense of it. Okay. Now, in doing so, right, I remember in the very first lecture we talked about how our thinking processes are built through evolution to be quick and reliable. That's where you see some consistent errors in how we react. So it is built to be quick for survival. But in our world, there is no need of survival in that sense of evolution, right? We need to understand things at a very different level. Okay. Although it is helping us for the most part, it hurts us in the other parts, because it it makes us it lets us no, it forces us to make decisions quickly, which are based on the concepts you have. Do you know where I'm going with this? I'm talking about stereotyping, right? We kind of have this general idea of say different races, different colors and whatnot, and when you are communicating, Because your system is built to be efficient and quick, we use these categories. Okay. Um, and this is the prototypical thinking. I will talk about what is prototypical thinking in the next slide. So so when you're thinking quickly without consciously being aware of it, you think about things through the lens of the concepts that you've created growing up. Okay. One example I usually give to my students when we talk about these concepts is using the example of a schema, or a schema is also a concept. It's like a situational concept, right? Your knowledge about what happens in a specific situation. Remember the Applebee's restaurant versus McDonald's restaurant. Okay. So um so what I tell my students is that just imagine you invited me to your wedding, and I was there, and you introduced me to your grandmother who's like 80 years old, and just imagine that I immediately touched her feet. Okay, now how would you comprehend this? Take a moment, take a pause, and think about how would you comprehend this particular event. Well, you try to make sense of things based on the existing knowledge, right? According to the existing knowledge you have about what typically happens at weddings, which is like a wedding schema, right? This is totally unexpected. This is totally unexpected. You don't expect people or see people because it's not a part of your schema at all, right? Then what you do, you force yourself to make sense of the new information um, in a way that fits your schema. So you may come up with some inferences like, oh, goodness, this is crazy. Yes, something to do with feet, or he's like really crazy. I really understand. I think I shouldn't have called this guy. This guy is crazy. So you make all sorts of inferences that I'm pretty sure are unauthorized. That's not what I was implying by when I touched your feet. And just to give you an idea, in our schemas, when we touch our elders' feet, in fact, when we meet our elders, the first thing we do is touch their feet for two reasons. Number one, to show respect. Number two, to seek their blessings. In fact, not doing so would be seen questionably. So, do you understand the point I'm trying to make here? Is that we have these concepts for quicker processing, but these concepts will limit our thinking. So, what should you do then? Well, you try to take a pause before you make the inference, and develop your schema over time. Learn about other cultures, schemas related to others. Okay. So we'll talk about prototypes in the next slide. Okay, so related to these concepts is what words we use and what we mean by it. So words and their meanings. Um, so a prototype is a typical example of a category or concept, right? So if I say a dog, the best example that comes to you depends on the specific experience you have, right? But if you compare overall, generally, different cultures will have different prototypes, typical examples, right? If I say vacation in one culture, it might mean different thing and evoke different images versus if I say vacation in some other culture. Okay. But as we said earlier, the concepts that are activated and the typical examples you have for each concept differs from culture to culture. So when I say wedding, different examples come up in your mind as opposed to my mind. Okay. So this is called prototypical thinking, or thinking through typical examples in a culture. And it changes from culture to culture, right? And if we are not careful, we might be stereotyping. So Prototypical thinking is automatic, system one thinking. Remember that? It comes automatically to you. What you have to do is to pause, think through, use system two thinking. That makes your thinking critical. But can we not make our critical thinking automatic? Yes, of course you can, but it'll take time where you have to deliberately learn ways to expand your typical examples for each categories that you have. So when you have the wedding as one schema, try to expand it. Learn about this particular ritual in other cultures. Try to meet people and get exposed to their rituals in their cultures and have this bigger frame so that when you see something's different, you have more schemas to connect it to and be not thinking prototypically and making inferences that are stereotyped. Okay. Um, Again, the prototypical examples are different for different cultures. That is the idea. Again, critical thinking is not abandoning system one, just being aware of system one's prototypical thinking and um, and taking a pause and learning more examples of the concepts. Okay, so we talked about psycholinguistics and we talked about how language is important, a part of thinking, and how to be aware of the constructs in language about implications, inferences, and whatnot. Okay, now we will move on to talk about the relationship between language and what do you say? Uh, Thinking in general, right? We'll talk about a specific idea that is language a tool or does language dictate how we think? Is the relationship one way or both ways or what? So we'll talk about whether language that we use can influence our thinking, can determine our thinking, which has implications, right? Which actually is implying that if you are a speaker of one language, the way you think is different from people who think in other languages. So that has a major implication. So it has to be clearly understood when we say the relationship between language and thought. Um, is it deterministic or is it at the cultural level where things happen not determined but has some influence but not control our thoughts? So we'll talk about that in the next slide. Okay, so Wolf was a linguist who proposed this idea that our thoughts, the way we think, is determined by the language we use. The basic idea is that different languages have different concepts, right? And because we think conceptually, remember the prototypical example and concept categorization is the basic perceptual process. Um, Given we think in concepts, right? And given different languages have different concepts, some have more for others. Um, our think is restricted if you have fewer concepts and not if you had more concepts. So the idea he was proposing is that he proposed then at that point was that language determines your thought. You think differently if you think in one language or the other because different languages have different number of concepts for each construct and each ideas and each idea not every idea is there in every language, so that's the basic fundamental thing. um, the and the arguments for I've told you, but there is enough research to suggest that that's not the case. Language will is is seen to be influencing our thoughts, the way we use language, like labels we use, the words we choose, um, and the way we use it in a positive way, euphemism, or in a negative way, or if we use what the meaning it implies in different contexts. In that sense, language can affect our how we think about it, but it's not that we think differently if you're using one or the other language. So the current perspective on the relationship between language and thought is that language and thought are connected and may influence one another. Language may influence thinking, but it cannot determine thinking. It doesn't determine thinking. In fact, the 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 reason for language even influencing, not determining thought, is has to do with the culture, not the language itself. Does it make sense? So there might be some words, or concepts, right, that mean something in one culture than the other, and that's why you have constructs, concepts for it in one language, but not the other. Not because it is this language that you have those constructs. Okay. Um, so one example I would give is when I first came to the US, I heard in my grad school a lot of mom jokes, and my friend Stacy, she came to me one day and she said like, your mom is blah 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 because she blah blah blah, and I it really hurt my feelings. I felt bad about it, and then I realized why when I gathered more information about it. So, although I still don't understand why it is only mother jokes are of that sort, dad jokes are of different kind. But the idea is that we don't have that in our culture. Makes sense? Mom jokes are not in our culture. Now, it's not because we are not using English, it's because it's not in there in the culture. We don't have this concept. So it's difficult for us to understand mom jokes. Does it make sense? It doesn't mean that I can't understand. I do understand what it is. I just need to know the cultural implication of it. So the idea is that language can influence your thought, right? But it cannot determine your thought. Now, if somebody comes and says that to me, like my same friend, I would be laughing and smiling and kind of trying to uh, trying to take it lightly and understand her actual intentions behind it. Okay, so we'll talk about how language um, and the words we choose when we're using language can influence us in a way that can manipulate our thinking and can change our behavior, right? And we'll talk about different ways people can use language to manipulate us. So we have to be aware of it. So we'll talk about that in the next slides. Okay, so let's talk about the first um, way the words we use can manipulate others' thinking, and how we have to be aware of it is the semantic slanting. Semantic slanting is to use words of specific kind to refer to ideas in a way that can emotionally influence others um, to take an action in one or the other direction. Okay. So it is the use of words to sway attitudes is what it's called. For example, pro-life, pro-choice, right? The words are used in a more positive fashion on either side to refer to their attitudes, where they're focusing on one and negating on the other. So when you say pro-life, it doesn't mean that you're not pro-choice, right? When you're pro-choice, it's not that you're pro-life, but the way they are labeled tries to make people think that it is one or the other, and emotionally connects them so that they will make decisions emotionally and not based on the actual philosophy behind the two different views about a topic. Okay, so equivocation is shifting meaning mid-discussion. Now, this is like you start a discussion assuming that we both have a common understanding of what we're talking about, right? Now, this is where the shared communication uh, applies in terms of use of language, right? But as one of the individuals in the discussion, if I change the meaning of the word, then it changes the dynamics of our discussion, right? That technique is called equivocating, where shifting the meaning of a construct midway. So that's why before you start a conversation, it is important that you both are on the same page in terms of what each word means and stick to that throughout the discussion. The other thing is about reification. Reification is the technique of um, treating abstract concepts as real, okay, and um, uh, and extending beyond that and kind of making people make decisions based on how you are describing uh, um, uh, these abstract concepts as real. Okay, um, so let's say I say my book is my knowledge, and I say my knowledge is here. My knowledge is oh, it's on the floor now. I'm taking a silly example here, but the idea I'm trying to make is that you're taking an abstract concept and making it a living being, and if you continue to do that, you may end up in a wrong path in terms of the decisions you make if it were an abstract concept versus a real being. Okay. The other technique people use is the bureaucraties, is the jargon, overly formal language. Like, have you ever read like a memo or something written by a lawyer? It has lots of jargon in it. Now, that's okay for lawyers, but if people start using jargony language in conversations, that's not good. And we'll talk about that in the rules of communication. Uh, um, Using very polished jargony language is not a representative of critical thinking. In fact, critical thinking is thinking in straightforward, simple terms, not complicating things, but to simplify things. Okay. Okay, so framing, anchoring, and contrast effects all relate to this idea of how our comprehension of the language is contextual. Okay. So, for instance, um, framing. Framing refers to the way you present information. Let's say if I say, oh, the price of this new shirt is $49, or if I say the sale price of the present this new shirt is $49, although it was $99 before. You see that the same price is presented in two different contexts. In other words, it's framed differently, and people go for this frame than the other. So it's influencing your decision. Does it make sense? So framing is the contextual effect of how you're presenting. One example is framing. The other one is anchoring. Anchoring is especially when you're trying to make judgments about something that you have very little information about and trying to come up with some estimates about it. And an initial reference to that concept will actually determine your judgment. For instance, the book talks about an example where participants, like one group of participants, if they're asked, um, uh, is the average price of a new car higher or lower than $14,000? Okay. Then they are asked, what is the average price of the car? Okay. Most likely people would say average car is higher and they will come up with a higher price, right? Just imagine if the same question is asked to other group, but the numbers are different now, where they ask, is the average price of the new car lower or higher than $44,000? And definitely most of us would say lower and or higher. And then you're asked a question, what is the average price of the car? The average prices these two groups would provide you would differ depending on whether they were presented or anchored with one or the other question. So that is the anchoring effect. Now, the contrast effect is um, is in comparison to. So so if someone asks like an open-ended question about um, I don't know, say, are you happy with your new job? Well, that's a very open-ended and a vague question. How do I report? Like you have to happier than my old one, or happier than my the one before it, happier than so there is no comparison there. And such questions are very open-ended questions. And in page number 93, there is actually a very good example of a kid who writes a letter to her mom, um, and by the time the mother comes to the end of the letter, right? The context in which it is provided makes her feel okay that her kid failed the exam. Does it make sense? Okay, go ahead and read it. It'll make sense. Okay, so coming to etymology and negation. Etymology is the study of the origins of meaning, right? Etymology fallacy is that if you use the word based purely on the origin of the word, but not how it is supposed to be used. Um, so that will that's a fallacy because a word may have origins in something, but the word gets used eventually. um, it actually evolves. Language develops. It's a dynamic thing, right? The way we use, there are some words that we don't use anymore, and the words we used before have changed their meaning now, and we have new words now. So it's a using the word based only on its origin. Like for instance, home screen, we didn't have that word before. It's a new word by combining two old words like home and a screen for web pages, where home screen is like the first page that you'll see when you are on a particular site. Negation. Now, again, double negation, we all know that it complicates comprehension by using not and using un, and like not and not, that will kind of complicate comprehension. But beyond that, negation also is a technique where if technique to persuade people to believe something that's not true, right? So for instance, if you say that person X is not a criminal, and if you repeat that information multiple times, what you're basically implying is the plausibility of him being a criminal. Makes sense? So if someone says, I'm not a crook, you are evoking the ideas in the listener, the possibility of me being a crook. So the idea is that when you use negation, the use of negation, especially multiple times, may evoke the plausibility of what is being negated, and may may make or force the listener to make inferences. Sometimes people do that to evoke such such thing in people, others, to influence their thinking and decision making. So be aware of that. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the comprehension strategies. Remember, we said that the basic thing we try to do when we remember the thinking knowledge framework, where we try to take new information and make sense of it. So when you're making sense of it, you're perceiving it or you are comprehending it. So that's a basic thing that the brain does. So how to make sure that we are use proper strategies or good strategies of comprehension. That's what we'll do in the next few slides. Okay, one of the best strategies to for comprehension is use some external organizational tools to help you with comprehension. So if you're reading something and you have an external tool like a concept map or your notebook and you're creating some representation of what you're learning, what it does is takes the load out of your working memory, and you can always rely on this new information that you have put together visually, right? So in that sense, there are many strategies. The basic idea is to have some external organization. Could be a tablet, a computer, your iPad, or a paper. And so you can use concept maps to visually represent externally what you've learned, or it can be um, if there is some sort of structure to it hierarchically that you're reading about, like birds, animals, vertebrates, whatnot, then you can use hierarchical structured concept maps, right? um, if there's then they have networks, right? Networks is about how one concept is related to the others, like we talked about the knowledge structure, how it is a network of interconnected concepts. And if there are multiple levels where the concepts are connected, you can use again matrices or multidimensional matrices, right? Where it compares multiple things on the same on some criteria and multiple criteria. Now, I would strongly suggest to review these things from this chapter from the assigned book, because these are really good strategies to improve your comprehension. Um, okay, so to enhance comprehension, right, you need to understand some rules of clear communication, both as a speaker and also a listener. Rule number one: be aware that you need to tell the listener what you believe they want to hear, right? You just cannot say what you want to say, but you need to have an idea of what you think they want to hear. Okay, that's rule number one. Rule number two: don't tell them what they already know. Okay, otherwise you are not engaging the listener. Okay, rule number three: change the way you convey information depending on who the listener is. Now think about it. If you're trying to explain a concept to, I'm using concept example here, but in general, to a fifth grader versus a college student versus a graduate student versus a teacher would be totally different, right? Because because the listener's knowledge, remember the general knowledge, the listener's experience in terms of the age, and listener's status in terms of the uh, 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 the structural hierarchical context, all these will determine, right, what level of communication you need to adapt. So be flexible in how to restructure your surface structure, right, depending on or taking into account the background of the listener. Rule number four, the very important thing: tell the truth, right? Now, These are the rules as a speaker you need to be aware of, and as a listener you need to pay attention to. But if these rules are broken, that's when a lot of miscommunication happens. For instance, misinformation, right? You take the information in assuming that the information that is sent to you is from a friend, so it's true, right? So that is misinformation. And if you pass it on to other person, that's misinformation. But the information that you received was intended with some bad intention to change your behavior, then that is a disinformation. Okay, so tell the truth. Then use a simple and straightforward style of communication. Right, this is where I was talking about um, bureaucracy and complex language versus simple language. Critical thinking is not about showing your verbal capacity to create complex sentences and using complex connectors. Critical thinking is about using simple language to convey ideas in a very simple fashion. Rule number six, use the context and the manner to clarify meaning, meaning that try to make things clear. Okay, that's why elaborating what you've said is an important thing. Or if you don't understand what the other person is saying, you can ask for elaboration and ask them more, give them more context, right? And you, as a speaker, use the context to kind of provide meaning. So these are some rules you need to be aware of, both as a speaker and listener. Okay, so take home points. So what we just learned were that much of our communication requires you to make inferences, both as a speaker in terms of deciding what and how to say based on the other person's knowledge and background, but also as a listener, you have to interpret and make inference about what the author might be intending to say. And we also talked about how labels and categories influence our thought. And we also talked about how words we use and the framing can influence our responses. Then we talked about the rules for clear communication, which can minimize our misunderstandings. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video lecture. I'll see you in the next one.